Last week we began a series of messages that will carry us through this Lenten season, this season of the weeks leading up to Easter, as we think about Jesus' journey to the cross and our own journeys that lead us to that place of recognizing our need for salvation, but also recognizing that Christ has set us free through his death and resurrection. Last week we looked at Psalm 121, which is a song about security and help. And we said this is a song, a kind of song in these Psalms of Ascent, Psalm 120 to 134, that would have been picture kind of as what the people would have seen or thought about as they were going to Jerusalem to worship God. This week we turn again to one of these songs that the people sang on their way to worship in Jerusalem, a song that we ourselves sing in our hearts as well this morning, a song fittingly enough about worship. Let's hear together the word of the Lord. I rejoiced with those who said to me, let's go to the house of the Lord. Our feet are standing in your gates, Jerusalem. Jerusalem is built like a city that is closely compacted together. That's where the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, to praise the name of the Lord according to the statute given to Israel. And there the thrones for judgment stand, the thrones of the house of David. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May those who love you be secure. May there be peace within your walls and security within your citadels. For the sake of my family and friends, I will say, peace be with you. For the sake of the house of the Lord our God, I will seek your prosperity. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, friends of Jesus, when was the last time that you got up on a Sunday morning and said to yourself or your family, you know what, I can't wait to go to church today? Now, my guess is, my prayer is that among those of us here this morning, a lot of us have had that thought, at least from time to time, and maybe some of you have that thought every week, that this is a highlight of the week for you, that as you're looking ahead to what the days in front of you hold, that one of the things that you get excited about is coming to this place at 10:15 on a Sunday morning, or maybe at 9 o'clock if you're here for church school, and saying, it's good to be with God's people in worship. Now, that would be the ideal. I know that the reality is that for a lot of us here, we don't have that feeling every Sunday morning. And it's not that we dislike coming to worship or that it grates against us. Maybe it does at times. But for a lot of us, I think, who are here every Sunday, it's not necessarily joy, but maybe more of a feeling of duty or responsibility that carries us here. When we look at the world around us, we can certainly see that joy is not the first emotion that people associate with worship. Depending on what survey you look at, it's between the number of Americans who go to worship on a Sunday morning is somewhere between 1 in 3 at the top end and 1 in 6 at the lower end. That means that 60 to 80% of Americans are not in church on Sunday. In Massachusetts, the numbers who attend are even lower than the national average, with fewer than a quarter saying that they attend weekly. And we know how this goes, right? When you say you attend weekly, that means that's sort of your intention. But things get in the way, right? You go on trips and you get sick from week to week, or maybe just something else happens. And sooner or later you find that it's easy to miss a lot of services, more than perhaps you intended. As I've said before, maybe to some of you in various contexts, we aren't at a point anymore in our national life where we can just assume that people are going to wake up on a Sunday morning and say, hey, you know what, I live right down the street from that church. It's been a while since I've gone. I want to see what's going on at Fairlawn. People who have never been to church or who have largely stopped attending are not likely to simply pick up a habit that they've long since given up or never had in the first place unless there is something to break into their lives and convince them that worship is necessary. Now, we could spend some time this morning discussing the reasons that people would give for not going to church, but this song points us in a different direction. It reminds us of the joy that worship brings to God's people. Psalm 122 reminds us of the reason that we do have to come together to worship God, which is that we are people who are called to be on a journey that leads to God, to our deeper fellowship with God. Psalm 122, as we said, is one of these songs that the people would have sung as they journeyed up to Jerusalem, going to the temple to worship. And we talked last week about what that journey meant. It meant not just sacrificing a chance to sleep in on a Sunday morning or sacrificing a few hours on the golf course. The psalmist is leaving life behind, maybe for as much as 2 weeks. And I think we realize that leaving life behind is a little bit of a challenge. But the psalmist says this is a trip that we are excited to make. I rejoiced with those who said to me, let's go to the house of the Lord. I rejoiced, in other words, when people said, hey, let's have a chance to sit and talk about God, to think about God, to understand God's work of redemption in my life, to gather with his people. That would be a good thing. Why? Because worship is a key part of that journey of going towards God, and the psalmist invites us to rejoice in that journey. Now, as we try to get our minds around what's being said in this psalm this morning, I want to think about the first half of this psalm really being 3 glimpses of Jerusalem, 3 impressions that the psalmist has of what the final destination looks like. What are we going to see when we get there, as he's saying to the people who are journeying with him? And what do we see? Well, the first of those has to deal with the way the city structures life. Jerusalem is built as a city that is closely compacted together, the psalmist says. Now, actually, all 3 of these things are kind of odd, but I'm just going to start by saying this is a little bit of an odd statement, isn't it? When was the last time you got excited about something that sounded like population density? I don't see a lot of hands. People move to the Blackstone Valley because they want to get away from the busyness of greater Boston, right? And the people of cities, I had the chance to live for at least a time in a city when I was in college, and there's a lot of excitement and fun things going on in the city. But for many of us, we like the pace of life that we have here in Whitensville and Northbridge, surrounding communities. It's quiet, it's peaceful, we have a lot of room. But the psalmist isn't talking about population. In Old Testament times, in David's day, the city most likely had a population of a few thousand who lived in a city that was the size of, about 10 acres or so. Maybe what you can think of as the spot that the church lot's sitting on, down to the reservoir there. Kind of take the stretch between Fairlawn and Goldthwaite roads. We're not talking about going to Somerville here, in other words. But if the psalmist is not talking about the size of Jerusalem, what does it mean that the city is closely compacted together? Or as some early translations, an early English translation puts it, that it's a city at unity with itself. And I think that last phrase, that translation, I think maybe helps us understand a little bit more what the psalmist has in mind when he's looking at Jerusalem. Because he's not just seeing a densely populated city, but one that leaves the impression that everything in Jerusalem has a place, and it has a place for the benefit of the nation. Jerusalem would have been filled with impressive government buildings, the king's palaces, and of course, the temple of God on the very highest peak of the city. It was a city that was decorated with the finest metals and stones and wood. For 2 Chronicles 9 tells us something about the construction of the buildings in Jerusalem. And for simple country folk who maybe never saw a town of more than a couple hundred people otherwise, this was an enormous place. The neat, orderly structure of the city fit its purpose as a center of social, political, and most importantly, religious life of God's people. Now we stop here to worship on our journey to the cross, and we are presented in worship with a structure for understanding our lives. When Israel worshiped before God in Jerusalem, they witnessed a story of salvation played out before them. The ceremonies, the sacrifices, the songs, all pointed to the ways in which God forgave the sins of his people and welcomed them, as we read a few minutes ago from Ezekiel, to be his people and assured them that he was their God. And that's what worship does. Worship, our services of worship, ought to remind us where we fit in with God. Just think about what the pieces of our worship service tell us, right? They tell us, first of all, that we are people who are called into worship before God. We are called Out of whatever else is going on in life, we are called to bring praise and glory and thanks to the God of heaven and earth. Worship also reminds us that we're people who need to confess. We're people who fall short of the glory of God. We're people who need to recognize the way that our sin offends God, and it drives a wedge between us and him and between us and our neighbors. But in confessing, we're also able to recognize the mercy and the grace of God for us, his forgiveness in Jesus. And it's out of that renewed sense of relationship then that we can go to God with the confidence that our prayers are heard in heaven. And then we go on to say that this is what we await from God. We await a word from God that directs our life, and that then he feeds us around his table before sending us out into the world with his blessing, with his promise of strength and grace to us. Worship says something about who we are as people forgiven by the grace of Jesus Christ, that we do what we do because God speaks to us in his word, and we repeat these things week after week, because if we didn't, it would be so easy to forget who we are in this world. We're also saying, in effect, that there's some things we don't believe about ourselves. When we come here week after week, we're saying to ourselves that we don't believe that we are just the product of some cosmic accident. That your life is simply the product of the inevitable determination of your genetic makeup. I mean, that's what the world will teach you, right? Life is an accident. Life is a confused mess that we sort out as best we can by trying to fulfill our desires as much as we can without stepping on each other's toes too much. But worship invites us to a place where life fits together. Because we are a part of God's plan and purpose to bring all of life under the lordship of Jesus Christ. Everything fits together in God's presence. There's a place for it. It's one of the things that we remember, one of the impressions that's left as we think about worship again. But another impression left on the traveler to Jerusalem was the people who are living in response to God's command. In other words, it's not just the fact that there's a big crowd there. Although that's kind of cool, right? We like being around crowds sometimes. It's kind of fun when church is full. It's fun to, part of the fun of going to a basketball game at Whitensville Christian School or wherever is that, when the bleachers are full and the crowd is loud, it feels fun. It's exciting. There's energy to it. But again, the psalmist is not just saying, hey, there's lots of people there and that's what's neat about going to Jerusalem. He's saying, no, there's a lot of people who are responding to God's command. The tribes go up according to the statute given to Israel. And we said this before, that the whole idea of the Psalms of Ascent is that 3 times a year the people were to go to Jerusalem because that's when God told them to go to worship for these 3 festivals. Now, the New Testament worship does not have the same sacrifices and structure as the Old Testament, but we still come together in response to God's command. We don't come simply as individuals, but we come as a community. When Jesus called people to follow him, he says, follow me because I want you to be a part of this group. And as a church, we respond to that. The church, in other words, is not just another voluntary organization that we come when we feel like it. And yes, I hope that you do often want to be at worship. I'm not saying that we should, every week, I got to go again. But there are times where I think to be honest with ourselves and to be honest about the purposes of worship, we need to come here because we don't feel like it. And that's a weird thing to say in our world today because we live in a world of authenticity, don't we? Where we're told that if you're doing something you don't really feel like doing, it's inauthentic, it's hypocritical, you shouldn't do that. And that colors our expectations about what we ought to do with our worship time too. Let me ask you this. How many sports teams would survive if no one went to practice when they didn't feel like it? Probably not very many. How many children would suffer if parents stopped caring for their kids because they didn't really feel like it in that moment? See, worship is not, first and foremost, the expression of a feeling. Worship is an act that we do in order to help direct us toward a feeling. When we come to the church, Stopping here on our journey to the cross, we see the people. People is one of the things I think that attracts us to worship. But I think if we peel away the layers on the surface of people's lives, we see a lot of different kinds of people. Some people just have busy schedules. Some people who are lonely. Some who have frustrations with their kids or maybe frustrations with their parents. Some who are hurting because of something that's happened to them in the last week. Some who just don't feel that good about their life in general. And God unites all of these people together, and he brings them here. Brings them into one community. Not because they like each other so much, although hopefully there's some of that, but first and foremost because they've heard God say, I want you to be a part of my people. I once heard the church described as, here comes everybody. I think there's something good in that, because if we stop seeing each other just as the group of people that we get along with on Sundays, and we come here because we have so much in common, rather than people that we are trying to walk towards God with, we miss out on something. Here comes everybody. What are these people teaching me about responding to the command of God in my life as they respond to that command in their own? The psalmist says, I remember the people. I remember the people. They're all going up there. But they're all going up there because they're trying to respond to something God is doing. And then the psalmist remembers a third thing when he's thinking about the trip to Jerusalem. And again, we kind of picture going along, he's giving these impressions, and oh yeah, there's one more thing. In Jerusalem, there's those thrones for judgment. And again, we kind of scratch our heads and say, what an odd thing to remember, because, the sad thing is that the church often does have a reputation for being judgmental, right? People do say, oh, church judgment. They associate those two things in their minds, but it's not usually a good thing. It's not something that we usually try to work towards, and certainly not something we'd be excited about. But the psalmist here is not saying that God's people are excited about being judgmental. Nor is he saying that in worship, our main goal is to make everybody feel really bad about themselves. That time of confession, let's really stick it to them so that, by the time they get done with those 3 or 4 minutes, you have thought about everything that you just did wrong in the last week. That's a victory, right? No, that's not what the psalmist is saying here. Judgment in the mind of the psalmist means not only what happens in court, not only a guilty verdict, but it's the entire system of making things right in the world. In ancient Israel, there's not that same neat distinction as in our system between the legislative and executive and judicial branches of the world. All of this authority fell in the ancient Israel to the king, who was the agent and the representative of God's rule over the people. And the king's job was to help the nation figure out how to live in response to what God was doing, to make things turn out right. Set things right in the eyes of a God who is the ultimate ruler of his people. And when we pause this morning on our journey to the cross, we see in worship the place where God sets things right through his rule. Now, how does this apply to worship? Well, worship reminds us, first of all, that God has made things right between himself and us at the cross. But it also reminds us of the importance of setting things right with each other. That's what God's judgments do. If we worship here and we celebrate that we're reconciled with God, and then we go out and we fail to offer that same reconciliation, forgiveness, and healing to people who sit across the room from us each Sunday, or people in our neighborhoods, people around the world, we've missed something of the point of the gospel. See, the gospel is not just an intellectual assent that, yes, Jesus died on the cross for my sin. It's the knowledge that information then pushes me out into the world to do something in relation to my neighbors. Judgment is the outcome of worship, not the goal. The judgment that we find in worship is not a judgment of guilty, but it is a judgment of not guilty. Because Jesus has died for our sins, because Jesus has paid the price for what you and I have done wrong, God sends us out from here saying, you are a different person. You're free. You're free. In fact, you're not imprisoned by sin anymore. You are enabled to go out of this place and live as my people. Now go do it. The sacrament of the Lord's Supper, I think, shows that all the more clearly. It reminds us in some ways of judgment. Our sins bear the judgment of God. That's a reality. But the Lord's Supper also reminds us of the sacrifice of Jesus that covers the weight of that judgment. And what happens at the table is not just that we get our hands slapped. In fact, what happens at the table is just the opposite. What happens at the table is God says, you know what? We are guilty. But you can still come here, and instead of punishing, I'm going to nourish. I'm going to strengthen you because the journey is a lot. And you need to know that I go with you on that journey. See, when we think about worship as a place of judgment, we pause to consider how forgiveness in Christ carries over into a life of the Spirit that brings healing and forgiveness not only to us, but then enables us to bring that healing and forgiveness of Jesus to others. We are people, in other words, who need God to set things right, but then who are invited into that part of sharing that with the world around us. So that's what the psalmist remembers as he goes along the way, these three impressions. And then at the end, just briefly, I want to touch on the fact, what does he do with all of this? Well, he prays. He concludes with a prayer for peace. And it's almost as if he's walking along and saying, hey, let me tell you about Jerusalem. Let me tell you about the kinds of things we're going to see when we get there. Oh, but let's pray. Let's pray for the peace of that place. I want this place of worship to be preserved and strengthened. Now, in some ways, I would say that there are applications in which there is a very literal way we can carry this out today, to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is a city that we all know lies in a part of the world that is deeply troubled. It has a long and intractable history, seemingly, of division and ethnic rivalry. And I think we can certainly be in prayer for that place. Pray that some of those divisions would be reduced. Pray that the people who live in that land would embrace the peace of the gospel of Jesus Christ. But the psalmist here is not only, or I would say not primarily even, asking us to pray for a piece of geography. What the psalmist is doing is asking and inviting us to ask that the place where God meets with his people would prosper. And prosperity in the church, in the Bible, doesn't just mean numbers. It doesn't just mean financial stability. Prosperity means there is a harmony where things fit together, where we see obedience to God's commands giving life, where we see God setting things right through his word. And there's a variety of reasons we could pray for this, right? And the psalmist says some of it has to do with the people around me. For the sake of my friends and family, I want the church to prosper. I want God's people to prosper. And I would hope that for a community like this, as we think about the people around us and the people that we enjoy, and our family members, that we want the church to prosper. We want Fairlawn to be a place where God's harmony is felt so that we can all experience what it is to be called deeper into relationship with God through Jesus Christ. But the psalmist doesn't stop there. He says, there's actually another reason that I really want that place to prosper, and that's this: for the sake of the house of the Lord our God. In other words, the most important reason that I can think of for the church to prosper, for Jerusalem to prosper, is so that God's name would be honored and worshiped and adored, that he would be seen as majestic and loving and gracious and compassionate and good and kind. And that's what we want with worship. We come here each week to talk about the kind of life that we desire to have with each other Monday through Friday, a kind of life through which God is glorified, as sins are forgiven, injustices are rectified, and God's peace is on display through us. And the question that Psalm 122 leaves us with this morning is really this: do you want the church to prosper in that way? Not just do you want to feel better about your own personal relationship with God, although that's a small piece of it, but really, do you want the church to prosper? Do you want the community to flourish? Do you want it to be a place where God is known and celebrated? And my guess is that all of us have some growth area to do in that. Because life gets busy and we walk out the door, we're going to come here late as it is, and then we can't find our shoes on the way out the door. And we barely make it with time to come to church. And that's what happens in a fallen world, right? But when we think about the destination, when we think about this as a stopping point, as we said last week, on our way towards heaven, a sign of what heaven will be like, a sign of what Jerusalem, not just this Jerusalem here in this world, but what the new Jerusalem above will be like. It forces us to ask, what would it mean for me to pray for the prosperity and the peace of God's church? To invest in it in a way that brings that prosperity and that peace to light in this world. We have a mission here. I don't know what the numbers are for Whitensville, for Northbridge. But if you look at the statistics, nationwide, statewide, there are thousands of people here in our own community who miss out on the joy of worship. And I'm not talking about going to them and trying to strong-arm them and saying, you really need to come here. Because you're missing out on, I don't know. Right? Because, let's face it, there are lots of places in the world where you can get better coffee on a Sunday morning. No offense to the people who make coffee here, okay? But we don't buy the most expensive coffee that's out there. There's lots of places on a Sunday morning where you can find something that may be more entertaining. There are lots of places in the world where the speakers might be better or the songs might be more enthusiastic. But for all of that, there is something that we do here this morning and every Sunday that is right. Something that is right because it points us to the love of God. And really the only thing that will call people to worship, or that will call them to worship maybe for the first time, is a sense that they've discovered Jesus, and his church may just have something to say about that. And so as we pause here this morning on our journey to the cross, we think not of the programs and activities that bring us here, but to the only sufficient reason for worship. We want to come because we see God. We've come to journey to God together as his people here. We've come because Jesus Christ has brought us here to show us how all things will fit together, to call us to a renewed obedience to him, and to set things right as the ruler of all. The psalmist says, I was glad when they called me to go to a place like that. And the question for us is, are we as glad? Let's pray.